Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past week in reading. Last weekend was the Get Graphic Readathon, so I'm going to start with 3 comics format books. The first one that I read was In Clothes Called Fat by Moyoco Anno. This is a look at the day-to-day life of a female office worker who has basically a problem with binge eating. She's very overweight at the beginning. She goes through a period of bulimia where she loses a lot of weight and then eventually gains it back. That's not really a spoiler because it's not really driven by that. It's driven more by her relationships with her coworkers, who are almost uniformly horrible people. This is an interesting book. I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it because it takes an incredibly harsh and negative view of basically everyone, including the main character, her cheating boyfriend, her really horrible coworkers. It is really harsh. And I don't think it's supposed to be a condemnation of, for example, Japanese business life, because I think there are some books that would take something like that in that direction. It just is a harsh look at some terrible people. And I will note, in case you were going to read this in public, there is a lot of very sexual and some non-sexual nudity in this, and some very graphic depictions of binging and purging. I will attempt to show the art style, but I had to look at it to make sure I was finding a page that was not incredibly graphic. But there you go. It is a standard kind of manga style. Yeah. Interesting, but I don't know how good it actually was. Some of that may be age. According to the back, it was kind of the first of its type, so I assume it's more maybe important than it is good. But in any case, it was interesting to read. Next up, I went in the opposite direction of something as graphic as that, and I read an all-ages comic, which is Volume 1 of Goldie Vance. This, I think, is meant to be a sort of Nancy Drew type book. I was a bit thrown by it because the way it's illustrated, I had been assuming that the main character was about 12 years old, and we later find out that she's 16, but because I'd spent so much time assuming she was 12, I was a little shocked by the way she's constantly driving cars and flirting with older women. So that all seemed a bit strange until they went, no, she's supposed to be a teenager. In any case, it's a pretty standard mystery story. It's a very pastel colored. The art on the cover is representative of the art throughout the book. It's cute, but there wasn't a lot to it for me. It's perfectly passable entertainment to share with your 8 to 12-year-old child, and certainly older kids and adults could also enjoy this, but it was a little fluffy. It's set in a bit of an alternative universe, late 50s, early 60s, with, I mean, it's cute. So after that, I thought I'd try another all-ages comic, and I read Rueshus' Newsprints, which is a story about a girl who dresses as a boy because she wants to sell newspapers and that's a boy's job. It's set in a kind of steampunk 1920s, which is an interesting setting because really most of the steampunk that I see is Victorian, maybe Edwardian, but to see that in the 20s was interesting. The art is pretty charming. Reading it as an adult, I think it is not necessarily as cohesive as it could be, but I definitely think that this is a book that would be great fun for kids in that 8 to 12 year range. And again, older as well. It's interesting looking, but there is a lot going on in this, and maybe too much, but still it was a fun one to look at. So those were the comics, and I wanted to keep going with light stuff, as I have said before. Next up, I was in the library and I saw Picture Us in the Light by Kelly Lloyd Gilbert. This, surprisingly for a teenage book, I first saw on Steve Donahue's channel a number of months ago when it was in a catalog somewhere pre-release. And I thought I would pick it up and see what it was about, since normally books about teenagers are not things I see on his channel first. This actually surprised me quite a bit. It had a lot more respect for the reader than I think a lot of YA books do, in that it trusted that you were going to figure out where it was going. It plays a bit with a non-linear story style in the beginning, and because of that there are points where it's not clear what's happened to people who will actually turn out to be dead later. So it was an interesting way of writing this type of story, which I think tends to be either much more linear or much more clear about the time jumping, because in this it was more subtle most of the time. So I quite appreciated that. This is about an 18-year-old in his last year of high school. He lives in the Bay Area and his family is basically lower middle class in a very rich and upper middle class area. He and most of his friends are the children of Chinese immigrants, but most of his friends have parents who were from Taiwan, whereas his parents are from mainland China. So there's a bit of a cultural and economic difference between his family and a lot of his friends' families. There's a bit of a he's in love with his best friend flowing in the background, but it's not even really a plot point. It's just allowed to evolve on its own, which I appreciated. I thought that given how a lot of these teenage books tend to beat you over the head with their romantic bits, I thought that was handled really nicely. For at least 2/3 of this, it seemed like it was just being a slice of life with one bit of school drama and one bit of family mystery. And unfortunately for me, later, as we get later in the story, it really runs with the family drama and adds drama on top of drama on top of drama. And while it was dealing with a lot of interesting issues regarding things like immigration status and adoption and suicide and a huge number of other issues, it really ended up being too much, and it felt like overkill at the end. It was funny, I was reading reviews on Goodreads and I saw a number of people who were complaining that nothing happened until the end. But for me, I thought it was much better until things started happening. Still, I was overall really impressed with how much respect the author manages to have for her audience in this, because I think a lot of books like this are written in a much more simplistic and straightforward way, so I appreciated that this wasn't. And I kind of liked that the ending reminded me of Schmendrick from The Last Unicorn. If you've read that book or seen the movie, he has a line about there are no happy endings because nothing ends, and this kind of played with that, which I liked. So yeah, I was surprised by this one. Alright, and then finally I picked up a mystery, and that was The Language of Secrets by Ausma Zehanat. This is her second book in her series about two detectives in a community police, or a culturally sensitive police unit in Toronto. In this particular one, they are infiltrating, one of the officers is infiltrating a potential terrorist cell, and the other one is keeping himself a step away because his sister may be engaged to a terrorist. Drama ensues. I wasn't nearly as impressed with this one as I was with The Unquiet Dead. I thought that one had a much better balance of the whodunit elements combined with the historical elements. So it just wasn't as engaging. It was a little silly. It just didn't engage in the same way. And the other issue I had with this is that I felt like this one was holding the reader's hand a little too much and teaching you a lesson. There was a lot of explanations of geography in Eastern Toronto. There's one point where it explains what Pacific Mall is. There's a lot of explaining really basic Islamic terminology. And with both of those things, I think if someone's interested, they could look that up. And I know in the previous book there were footnotes, but instead in this one there are characters saying really, I don't know, there's too much information like that. It read too much of, let me teach you a little bit of, and I just thought that was a little unnecessary and didn't have enough respect for the reader. But I think some people enjoy that and would actually be reading a series like that for those elements. So while that irritated me, I think that might have more of an appeal to other people. As with most mysteries, it gets a little silly at the end, but it worked better than a lot of them do. So I still quite appreciated this, but it was definitely a step down from the first one, which I thought was really impressive in how it dealt with issues. So yeah, that was my week. It was a lot of lighter reading again, so I might get to something more interesting over the next week. We'll see. And that's it for now. Ciao.